Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on experimentation and the scientific method in launching and scaling entrepreneurial firms. I'm Chiara Spina. I'm an assistant professor of entrepreneurship at INSEAD, in case we haven't met. And it's great to bring this panel today. I've been organizing this with Tim Hott, who just left, but I also like to thank Jax and Gary from the entrepreneurship division for their support in organizing this event. So I'm only going to take literally 2 minutes to explain how the panel is going to work. And I think what's very interesting for those of you who attended the other panels from the entrepreneurship division this morning is that we can see how there is this thread of experimentation going on. The first panel on creating companies for social good was really talking about how companies, Maka actually was talking about how companies experiment in different ways. We also had the second panel on Shopify, and it was really cool to see in practice how entrepreneurs actually use these digital tools to experiment and figure out whether it makes sense to enter at all. So I feel that this conversation ties in very nicely with what else we discussed today. It's going to be a little bit more high level. We're going to talk about experimentation and sort of see what scholars in this area have done, as well as what are some of the promising directions that they think this topic is going to go into. So how is this session going to run? We have a distinguished panel, and I'd like to thank very much everyone for joining us. We're going to start with Alfonso Gambardella, who's a professor at Bocconi University. Then we're going to move on to Riitta Katila, who's at Stanford University. Then Mary Tripsas at UC Santa Barbara. And last but not least, Todd Zenger from University of Utah. The panelists are going to have about 12 minutes. Kindly keep an eye on me. I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning. And I'm going to ask everybody to wait for their questions until the very end of all the presentations. We're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&As, but I hope that this would just be the start of a conversation that will continue way beyond today's panel. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Alfonso, our first speaker, to join us. Thank you very much, Alfonso.
Thank you. So you have to use the
You
mic?
may, yes, you may use the mic. This is the clicker. I'm just going to put up your slides.
Oh, what a nice picture.
It's the official one.
Did you experiment with different pictures?
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. Do I have to do something? No?
Let me just ask, because I think we'll switch to PDF. It's always the technology that fails you. Let me just ask. Could you come and help us?
I would like the floor speaker.
Yeah, it was.
The one in the floor pulled out earlier. The power.
There's no input, so I don't think it's a problem with the type of document. I don't think it's a problem with the laptop. It's definitely a problem with the projector. I don't know.
Maybe we can have one of them start and then I can do it later if we fix the problem. Whatever you say.
So I think everyone has lights, so I think it's.
You think it's a general problem because I don't have my slides on PDF.
Because I think it's a
But
general
you're a
problem.
really good singer, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
To do that.
It's a general problem of just like the laptop not showing the slides. Problem.
Yeah, but the file is only set up, so it's for you.
They're showing on here?
It's showing on here, yeah. It's a little small.
Hold it up for everyone.
I'm not even going to bother with slides. For 7 minutes. For 7 minutes, do you really want to? We can wing it.
This happened in my morning session too. So don't worry about it. It's happening.
You could open a Zoom session, people could pull out their laptops.
Learn to like hybrid teaching.
Yeah, that's right. Pull it up on your phones.
could all probably talk without slides at this point if you're, I mean, if you want us to.
Alfonso, why don't you get started, and then
Okay.
we'll sort out the slides in the background, and hopefully we'll go up as you talk.
Okay, so it's a little. Should I start? Yeah. Okay, it's a little hard for me to do it without slides because there were a few things I wanted to show. But let me try. Let me try in any case. So, what do I want to talk about? What I want to talk about is essentially some of the micro foundations of what I would call. Let's see. Okay, good. Excellent. And does it even work? Yes, super. Okay, super. We are all set. So what I want to, let me try to recover some of the time. So here is the story. I want to talk about some micro foundations of what I would call the theory-based view of the firm. It's interesting because we have talked about this topic by calling it a scientific approach. We were quite naive maybe because this is what was evocative to us. And then people started to question us on the philosophy of science. What do you mean by scientific and so on and so forth. So let me wave my hands. Let me talk about the theory-based view of the firm. And if you go to the strategy literature, you can find Jackson, Nickerson, Todd, Teppo Felling, Felipe Sazar, Giovanni Gavetti, even Dan Levinthal. They have a pretty good view of what they mean by the theory-based view of the firm. This is what we mean, okay? And I think there is excellent work that does this. What we did is simply to show through randomized controlled trials that this theory-based view of the firm seems to work. Essentially, if you push people to think theoretically, building mental models about what they want to do, it actually leads to some performance. So what we try to do with Arnaldo and other people here, we try to go at the other extreme. So now, let's go with the micro foundations. Let's understand what are the real micro foundations. Why is this actually working empirically, and why the intuition of the theory of the firm was an interesting one. So we paired with decision scientists and asked them. And they said, oh, but this is a big problem. Why is it a big problem? Because, you know, we decision scientists know how to solve a canonical problem, in finance, for example, where essentially we know everything. We know the states, and we know the probability distributions. And they say sometimes we make the claim that we do not know the probability distributions, and this is what we try to do. What you're asking us is a different problem. It's a problem which people do not even know the states. And then we told them, okay, yes, so help us. This is the problem in strategy. All the rest is irrelevant for strategy. So they actually told us the following. Oh, you really want to think about how people learn about forming states? Here is the way to think about it. So what do they say? Decision makers typically focus on a set of attributes. What are attributes? Elements of the problem that have uncertain realizations. What do they do in their mind? They form what they call a space of attributes. What is a space of attributes? Well, think about, and we have in mind a specific case here, Mario Moretti Polegato, the guy who actually invented the Geox shoe, the shoe that transpires, okay? And he had this problem. He said, the key attributes is, will people feel the need for a refreshing shoe? Will there be a technology that enables the air to come in, but not the water? And he said, so let me say that the need of people can be either high or low, and the technology can be either good or bad. So he focused on this space of attributes. Things can be high need, good technology, high need, bad technology, low need, good technology, low need, bad technology. He said, all the rest is irrelevant. These are the states I'm going to focus upon. And then what he said is, he used logical links. He said, well, but if I have a good technology, people will see the shoe in the shelves and will buy it. So his logical link is an implication. A good technology will imply that there is high need. So what did he do de facto? He repartitioned the states. He said, so the relevant states are low, good, and all the three together. And he said, this probability that I have low technology and good demand, it's actually low. Because this is what the implication implies. And then de facto, what they said is there is a subjective probability that this is kind of low. And so what is a theory? A theory, it's a family of probability distributions with parameters theta in which essentially these thetas are low. So they are in a world in which the probability of that subspace, LG, is actually low. Now, you may say, well, is it good? Is it interesting? Well, to some extent, yes. Because then they learn about that probability through experiments. So what do? They put the shoes out and see whether that probability is actually high or low. So what is the story there? Unfortunately, when they run these experiments, there are possibilities. Either the range is very high, you are very uncertain about your theory. So yes, it could be 30%, but it could also be 70% or 0. Or it could be very narrow. Yes, it's 30%, and it could be 31 or 29%. So the theory can be reliable in a different way. Now, what is the problem? And this is what we learned from our friends, decision scientists. That if you look at the problem like this, the experiment is irrelevant. Because any experiment will have, as an expected value, the same thing about your prior. You don't run experiments in tossing a coin. You know the probability is 1/2. You don't need to run experiments on tossing a coin. Here is the same thing. You have a representation of the world. Ex ante, you don't run the experiment because you have incorporated all the information. So when you run the experiment, you think, okay, it can be 35% with probability 1/2, 25% with probability 1/2. This is what the experiment will give me. So before the experiment, there is no incentive to run the experiment. So what do? You compare alternative theories. This is what Mauro Moretti Polegato did. He said, should I sell the transpiring shoe, one model for everyone, or should I sell a bunch of different types of shoes so that people can change one after the other? So his main theory was, if I can get a good technology, I will sell only one pair, because people can wear it all the time. If I cannot find a good technology, and so water enters into the shoe, I will make a cheaper shoe, okay? And so that people can buy a bunch of them, and so that they can replace them every day. So he was not working on one theory. He was comparing alternative theories. Now, if you compare alternative theories, something interesting happens. Because you may have a more plausible theory with a higher variability, very unreliable. And you can have an alternative theory that is actually more reliable. What do? You want to test the more unreliable theory. You want to test the theory that you expect less likely to happen, that you are less certain about. Why? Because if the experiment is successful, you go here. If the experiment is unsuccessful, you actually go with the alternative theory. This is a confirmation experiment because you try to confirm the more plausible theory. But you can do a falsification experiment if the less plausible theory is more uncertain. So essentially, in this case, you try to falsify your more plausible theory. You actually go here or here. And if you are rely very much on the theories, you basically stay here. So what is the message here? You always want to compare a theory with an alternative theory because this is the incentive to run the experiment. Now, case Luxottica. Arnaldo knows this case very well. In the 1970s, no one ever thought that you could use eyeglasses for fashion. Only an Italian could think about it, okay? It was crazy, okay? And what did he do? Eye surgery was coming in, the alternative theory, and so he said, oh, my business of spectacles for eyesight defect is going to be a problem. So what do? I basically need to find an alternative theory. And what was the alternative theory? This crazy idea, well, but I can sell glasses to people so that they look good. He went, tested, and found that this fairly unreliable theory, people like glasses as fashion, was in fact very effective. And so rather than countering the eye surgery, he actually moved to eyewear. Today, Luxottica is one of the leading companies of the world selling high fashion glasses. Now, quite a few people pushed us, but this is lean startup. Then what did we do? We thought carefully about this question. Is it lean startup? We think that the key difference between what we do and lean, we went back, read lean startup, and so on and so forth, is that in lean startup, you do not test an alternative theory. You test the status quo. In our case, the normative aspect that we push, you test an alternative theory. Let me tell you what the difference is. You see these numbers, 2, 4, 6. You have a theory. This is a sequence of even numbers. What is the test you run? You could ask me, can 8 be the next number in the sequence? This is a confirmation bias. Because if I tell you yes, you confirm your theory. You are much better than me, and so you ask me a different question. Can 7 be the next number in the sequence? Okay? According to my answer, I can either falsify your theory or not. But if I do not have alternative theories, what do I learn? If I tell you yes, you learn, okay, this is not a sequence of even numbers. But suppose you have an alternative theory. And the alternative theory is, this is a sequence of increasing numbers. You ask me, can 7 be the next number in the sequence? I tell you yes. What is the difference? You learn. In the latter case, you learn more about the environment. Why do you learn more about the environment? Because you have an alternative theory. You are not testing whether your theory is false or not. You are not testing whether the Geox shoes is a good business or not. You are testing the transpiring shoes against an alternative world. What is the difference? Here you learn about the world. Here you only learn to test and falsify your theory. Now you tell me, easier to say than to do. Let me tell you one thing. This is typically very hard. And it can be a real source of competitive advantage. We have talked to some companies. The real source of competitive advantage is to come with alternative theories you test. And by testing it in this way, you don't just falsify or not one perspective, but you actually map the environment and you learn much more. Conclusions. This is normative. This is an important point I want to make. This is not what it is. As strategy scholars, we like to think what it should be, okay, not what it actually is. We think that comparing a focal theory with a less plausible theory, it's an excellent way to conduct exploration. It's an effective way to conduct exploration. And here is the counterintuitive part that sounds unreasonable. Always test the crazy theory, the theory that is less reliable. Always test something that is actually not obvious, and focus on that theory if the experiment succeeds. Don't test theories if you are very confident, if you have theories that are not reliable. What is the difference? The difference is between mapping the environment and learn with one experiment about multiple theories as opposed to testing specific hypotheses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfonso. We now have Riitta presenting. I'm just going to put up the slides.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Great to see. Wow, there's a lot of you. Great to see everybody here. Thank you for joining. I got to say that I think at the end you'll see that Alfonso and I agree on more than he thinks.
No. I think I agree with you on everything. So.
We'll see. Oh, let me grab this quickly. Okay, so our task was to find 2 or 3 things that we already know a lot, like, too much about in terms of experimentation, and then one thing that we should be looking at, we don't yet know about, right? I think that was our task. So I go that route. So what do we know about experimentation and what should we know? And I'm, of course, Miss Lean Startup in the discussion, as Alfonso is smiling because he knows where I'm going with this. You'll see. But I take a Lean Startup lens on experimentation, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so my colleagues at the panel are much more knowledgeable about experimentation in general. I will take much more focused lens on what I know, which is lean startup-based ideas on experimentation. Here's my co-author, Mike Leatherby. There's also Carrington Motley, who is postdoc at CMU, is graduating from our group, who has joined the team. So we are working on some of the new ideas that I'll talk about later. So that's the team, and we have an SEJ 2020 that I will build on, an HBR that's more of more of an executive version of the stuff, and then of course Google us on YouTube. We have Steve Blank and us talking about Lean Startup. Okay, that was the ad section. Now to the more serious academic stuff. What do we know? So about how entrepreneurs experiment. So we've done studies on lean startup teams. So of course what I talk about is teams that have an idea, go through lean startup experimentation, and then we'll follow and see how they do afterwards. So there are many other kinds of experimentation, which I think is an important point to make just before I start. So what do we know in this particular genre of experimentation about entrepreneurs? So who experimented? Let me just get this out of the way because these are quite different people. Is there a fly going around? Like across the screen? That's kind of funny. So our sample is these entrepreneurs in the US. That's the first point to make. Particular one, we are looking at 152 teams in this sample that I'm talking about. They experimented. This is a government program in the US, and they went through 8 weeks of this experimentation training. That's called Lean Startup, which is the National Science Foundation's I-Corps program in the US, if some of you are working on this similar data. And the teams these are real teams. They are 3-person teams typically, and then we have team week observations on their experimentation efforts and what the outcomes are for that startup. Okay, and they all start with an idea. So that's the setting. So other kinds of experimentations are beyond what I know, but that's what I'm going to talk about. So first thing that I think we know a lot about already, at least in the lean startup context, is good experimentation starts with hypotheses. And I think this is where Alfonso, now there are 2 flies, Alfonso might agree with me. So it seems pretty basic, but what we established a couple of years ago in the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal, SEJ article, is that there's actually a link between writing a hypothesis and testing more ideas. And then that chain continues. You test, and then you converge on an idea or not, and then maybe formulate another hypothesis, maybe in Alfonso's terms, another theory, and start again if the first one didn't work. But specifically, what we pretty convincingly, I think, showed was that if you have a hypothesis versus not, you're going to be better off in the experimentation process. And it seems so basic to all of us, especially if you're on the quant side of things and more deductive strategy scholar. But for entrepreneurs, this is not given. Okay, so I think we know a lot about that hypotheses probably are a good thing. And I know my colleagues will disagree with me later, but we'll see. Then number 2, the second big finding, I think we also have established that experimentation is not for everybody. So what we specifically found that entrepreneurs who think they are very good at something already, in our case it was MBAs, who just hated the lean startup method. They just didn't want to formulate any hypotheses. They didn't want to test them. They just wanted to stay as far away as possible from this process. And engineers, I'm an engineer by training. Engineers love this. We love, my whole life is, according to my family, a hypothesis. So I make a hypothesis and test everything. So engineers love this. So depending on who the team is, experimentation methods might work differently. I think that's something that we could probably all agree on. And then, why is it then the underlying mechanisms? I think it's a very interesting story right there. So why are business experts, why are MBAs so disliking something like Lean Startup, that is hypothesis testing method? Maybe because they already think they know, so they don't have to start from the basics, okay? So maybe there is something that threatens their expertise. So I think that's probably we could agree. And then there's learning by thinking versus learning by doing, what your, sort of where your expertise, what is your training? How are you trained, and how that method experimentation might clash with that. Okay, oh, and one more point. So what we also showed is the paradox that actually the people who are the experts who don't like the method would actually benefit most from it, because they have the background to actually, when the hypotheses are tested, to interpret the results. Okay, and then my final slide, I think, which is the open question from Chiara. What should we be thinking about right now? So especially, well, I would say across the world, the diversity of entrepreneurial teams, whether that's the entrepreneurial finance side or the startup teams themselves, is a big issue. We don't have enough women. We don't have enough underrepresented minorities. We just don't have enough diversity in the teams. So what I'm really passionate right now, and this is in the context of we're looking at national academies and the SBIR programs in the US, and finding some very preliminary data and evidence that these experimentation methods can actually bring in a more diverse set of entrepreneurial teams. They give you basic steps of entrepreneurship. So this is an emerging idea. I don't really have any published evidence at this point. I have some data patterns, but I have a hunch that this is going to be one of the big questions. And if you think about entrepreneurship, it's been sort of kind of a black box or closed club. So is it possible that, whether it's Alfonso's experimentation method or mine, maybe that's a stepping stone for more diverse groups of entrepreneurs to get engaged and say, hey, I think entrepreneurship may also be for me. I could do it too, if given a chance to try out something that is already out there. So that's, I don't think I have any more slides. Okay, so this is just to wrap up what we already know, and then what I think could be one of the next steps. And I just wanted to give a shout out also to Carrington Motley, who is a postdoc at the moment. He's looking at the benefits of failure in the context, because if you experiment, there will be a lot of failure as well. So he's looking at that question. So yeah, I think that those are my 3 things I wanted to share. So thank you for listening, and over to Mary.
As Riitta mentioned, we were given instructions to talk a little bit about what do we already know, and then what do we think are interesting questions for future research. And I think maybe the organizers were running a little experiment to see, are women more likely to follow directions than men with panels? And so far, we have 1 no, 1 yes, and you're going to have another yes. We'll see where Todd comes out. Or it could be an alternative theory of people based in California are more likely to follow directions. I don't know. Italians do whatever they want. Anyhow, so
That's a theory with low variability.
yeah, well, actually, a good point.
No need to experiment on it.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we know, and then some things I think we could think about going forward. So even though Lean Startup has gotten a lot of traction now, I would argue that this isn't something new. And in fact, back in 2002, when I was teaching entrepreneurship at the Harvard Business School, Paul Marshall, a decision theorist, had a nice note on the value of information in entrepreneurial ventures. And we had this course, The Entrepreneurial Manager, and I actually went back and dug up, one one of my teaching slides from our lecture on how to experiment, and we had a whole set of slides on how to do hypothesis testing. So, you have a hypothesis about an opportunity to create value, and the business plan, models, whatever, lots of different things. You design and run experiments, and we broke it into partial versus holistic. Partial tests were probably more in line with what we would now call lean startup. And then, you evaluate it, and you cycle around, and then, maybe you decide to exit, right? So from a teaching perspective, this has been around for a long time. From a research perspective, I think at this point in time, around 2002, Amar Bide, who some of you may know, had written this book about entrepreneurial ventures and had this phrase called opportunistic adaptation. So the idea was, startups are these, morphable entities that opportunistically adapt, and the idea was not so much that firms actually engage in what Fiona Murray and I ended up talking about in a 2004 book chapter, what we called purposeful experimentation. So here, our thought was simply to demonstrate, how is it that some firms are actually engaging in what we called, interestingly enough, the scientific method applied by entrepreneurs to the key parameters of their business. And so Fiona's background, for some of you may know, is she was like a bench chemist, and her PhD is not in management, it's in chemistry, right? And so we took a company, Surface Logics, an early stage technical company, and it's a very descriptive paper looking at how did they experiment, right? And so we actually, found, and, we went in there looking to see, are they just opportunistically adapting, or are they doing something more purposeful? And it was more purposeful, right? And we broke it into, 3 different domains. They experimented around the technology, the market, and the business model. And then we had this sort of framework that came out of it saying we could think about classifying these experiments on 2 dimensions. One would be, are these sequential experiments along the lines of a lean startup methodology, or are they doing some things in parallel? And then were they manipulating just one thing in an experiment or multiple? And of course, for those of you who are scientists by training, multiple manipulations in one experiment, generally speaking, isn't a great thing. But for startups that are trying to move quickly, they might actually want to do that. And we found that, they engaged in experimentation across all 4 of these boxes. And, we didn't call that box of, one sequential, testing one thing sequentially across a bunch of things in time, lean startup, but, that's probably what you could call it. And even, Riitta McGrath, who won the Practitioner Award yesterday, the C.K. Prahalad Award, her work with Ian McMillan on discovery-driven planning has a lot of very similar ideas as what we now call lean startup. So I think we know this kind of stuff is important, right? And then the next question, so this is just saying, so we were doing this in teaching and research, and then, in practice it popped up and, got a lot of traction, right? So in line with what Riitta was saying, not everyone, however, engages in experimentation. And so she was talking about how the background of the people in some field experiments affected whether they would experiment or not. So Tiana Zuzul and I have this paper that came out a couple years ago in ASQ looking at how the nature of founders and their sense of what does it mean to be an entrepreneur influenced the level of experimentation or not in this emerging industry, air taxis. So this is an industry that is waiting to happen and may never emerge, certainly not in the state that in the early days they thought it would emerge. So we had a lot of different firms entering this industry, and what we looked at after, this was one of these inductive, we never thought we were going to land at founder identity as an explanation for what was happening here, but that ended up being what emerged very strongly in the data. We ended up discovering that there were actually 2 very different senses among the founders of these firms of what does it mean for me to be an entrepreneur. So some of them, who we call discoverers, saw their role as very much in line with what we would love them to see, lean startup, right? They basically say, of course, I want to say I'm trying to start a new industry, but I'm just focused on our business, right? I just want to make money. If I don't change the world, fine with me, as long as I make a bunch of money. And then there were these other folks who were revolutionaries for whom, sure, they wanted to make money, but if they made money, they would be very unsatisfied. their job as an entrepreneur is to change the world. I'm going to shake things up, do things that seem impossible. You know, we could really change aviation. And so, depending upon the background of these folks, it affected how they approached this industry. So this is the founder of Imaginaire saying, or sorry, Linear Air, our basic approach is test and learn, right? It's almost as if he took our entrepreneurship class, except he didn't. But we went through, and this is just mapping all of the different changes and things that they did over time, playing around with trying to understand what was happening in this evolving market. And then similarly, the industry is still being figured out. We don't know what's best. I'm trying it one way. We think it might work. And, so they engage in a bunch of different experiments as well. And they frame them as experiments. And then we have these revolutionary founders where the models really were very stable. Nothing really changed. So Dayjet, offered a certain kind of service, and that was kind of it. This other company, Sats Air, had pretty much the same business model from the get-go. They made a couple of small changes over time. They added maintenance to airplanes. They added freight services. But all these firms experiencing an industry in which there are clear signals that something needs to happen or change for the industry to emerge and take off, and yet very, very different approaches. So one might ask, which is better, right? Do we want to be discoverers or revolutionaries? And so I think Riitta and Alfonso would be on the side of, well, yes, we should experiment, and of course that's going to be better. And I think in this paper, at least, we argue, as with much in management, it depends, right? So revolutionary founders, frankly, are the kinds of founders that we love to valorize, right? Elon Musk, Richard Branson, people who are out there to change the world. And a lot of the work in entrepreneurship focuses on we should be shaping new industries, we should be creating ecosystems, we should be doing all of these things to invest in getting a new industry or market up and running. And so those are the kinds of things that a revolutionary founder would tend to do. The potential downside, of course, if you're doing those things is that you've made investments and you get tied in, and it might make it more difficult for you to change and do different things. So being a revolutionary isn't necessarily bad. If you get it right, you might actually, for the Americans in the room, hit a home run instead of striking out. But you're also more likely to strike out. So there are trade-offs. I think this question of who experiments or experiments effectively and how backgrounds and potentially teams might work together to do a better job of this. Maybe we should have a mix of engineers and other folks per Riitta's data, or here, on a founding team, you might actually want to combine revolutionaries and discoverers to get sort of more of a balance. Is kind of an interesting thing that when Riitta was talking occurred to me, and is not on my topics for future research slide, that these are the things that I thought were interesting going forward. The ecosystems is all the buzz now, right? And most organizations, even in industries that typically would have products that are standalone, organizations are having to work with other companies and their products and interface with them to deliver something to an end consumer. And so when you start to actually think practically about experimentations, it's not always under the control of one organization to be able to do some sort of, in particular, customer-focused experimenting. You need to potentially coordinate with other players in your ecosystem in order to actually figure out what you can do. And so if you're trying to design optimal experiments, how do you actually do that in the context of an ecosystem where you need to work with other firms to even run the experiment? And then what is the role of experimentation, not just in helping you to learn more, but in actually establishing some sort of legitimacy with your external stakeholders? Because of all of the buzz around lean startup, do venture capitalists expect you to have a box that says, oh yes, we have MVPs, we did this, we did that? And then finally, how do investors influence experimentation strategies? So I don't know if I ran over my 2 minutes because I wasn't looking, but so now we are about to see the result. Did Todd follow instructions or not?
So I am afraid that I am going to confirm the gender hypothesis that Mary espoused. not the California hypothesis, because I am from California, so we can set that one aside. It would be gender. It's possible that I've been accused numerous times over the last several years that I have selective listening. I didn't read. I don't know what. But I. I don't think it was in.
The more general theory. Men do not read.
Men do not read instructions.
Despite that, had I not had this preamble, I think I could shoehorn what I'm about to say within the instructions that I was given. Perhaps given. Maybe. Okay. So, I want to talk at a high level about some insights around this theory-based view or scientific approach to entrepreneurship and management. I actually am very fond of obviously the theory-based approach, but the scientific label I think also works. So the notion is that entrepreneurs, strategists are like scientists seeking to compose value in a complex and uncertain world. That's the only slide you're going to have with a nice background. I just love the background. That's why it's there. And I want to talk about sort of some what I see as foundational principles. First, I think that that entrepreneurs are not, they're not ivory tower scientists here. So some of the pushback you get is like, well, these they're not ivory tower scientists, but they're like real scientists, that they're out solving problems. They're like engineers who, if they're effective engineers, have hypotheses and are actually acting like scientists. I think the agenda also is very pragmatic or pragmatist in its focus and doesn't have, as brilliantly articulated by some of Richard Rorty's work, little use for the objective-subjective distinction or the made-found distinction. Rather, what pragmatists like real scientists do is they make up theories and try to live with them, and if they work, if they generate and yield something, then we call it a discovery. Secondly, the agenda here is largely normative. It's not trying to be descriptive. We're not trying to say this is how entrepreneurs or managers do behave, or that most of them behave this way, but rather this is what better entrepreneurs do. The presumption is that those who don't do it would do better if they did it. That is, that there's an opportunity for an effective treatment. Therefore, the theoretical work in this space is of the, type, what makes an effective theory? Can we help people think about how to compose better theories? How do we make them better? How do we help them test these theories better? How do we optimally then revise theories? How can we use a scientific type approach to this process of learning as a manager, learning as an entrepreneur? And of course, from an empirical standpoint, then the nature of the empirical work here, and we've got Chiara and Elena and others that have really contributed to this empirical work. The nature of the empirical work is, if we teach people to, with this kind of theory, with some kind of intervention, does it actually improve the outcomes that we observe? And some of the early preliminary work here is that we can make a difference. We can actually teach people. Certainly, the lean startup work that's empirical is in this same vein as well. Third, that we see that we as actors, all of us, but also entrepreneurs and managers, we see through theories, both whether these theories fit the data, but it's through the seeing that we also recognize what doesn't fit the data. We actually see surprises through the lens of a theory. And I'll talk more about that later, that all theory, and Einstein has a wonderful quote about this, that whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. Your observation is always shaped by the theory, including your observation that this is a surprise, this doesn't fit, this is unknown. That's only knowable through the lens of what you think you know, right? So it's all filtered by theory. so you know, some of this theoretical work is really much of that vein. How do we you know, well, we'll talk about this more a little bit. How do we test theories? But this recognition that what we're observing is seen through the lens of a theory. So what does an entrepreneur as scientist do? Well, they form theories, and I particularly think about theories as having causal structure, that they have assumptions, or there's a sense in which if we solve these sub-problems, that it will allow us to solve some larger problem, that theories are more than just simplified representations of the environment. They're representations that have an underlying causal architecture and structure to them. That pursuing a theory-based belief then is about experimentation, but there are lots of forms of experimentation. It's not a very narrow classification of experimentation. It's more than blind local search. It's more than a sequence of calibrated minimum viable products. Especially when experimentation is costly, this question of how you sequence experimentation. Experimentation is, as we'll talk about testing assumptions or your ability to solve sub-problems that you think are vital to solving some broader problem. And then there's a final stage, which is you're revising theories. And this is more than just sort of Bayesian updating. It's about being shaped by surprises that arise as you try to experiment and observe outcomes. And it's very much about belief revision. It's theory-guided belief revision. That's what a scientist does particularly well. So what's a theory? So one of the practitioner pieces that Teppo and I, along with Alfonso, have crafted is a tool that sort of helps entrepreneurs in particular, but also managers, sort of think about how to compose a theory. And it's a push to think about what you uniquely believe. Think about the core problem that you're trying to solve, which your belief is that if you solve this core problem, it's going to introduce value. It's thinking carefully about the sub-problems, and then the causal structure is if we can solve these sub-problems, our confidence is that we can solve some overarching problem. Timo Erik and Jens Smith, who are both here, think about theories as having kind of an overarching hypothesis, but it's based on premises or assumptions, and all different, I think closely related conception of what a theory is. There's a sense in which there's a close relationship between the problem formulation and what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and the theory formulation is a wonderful quote from Simon from Models of Man, in which he talks about this interaction between the gradual construction of the representation, call it a theory, the representation of the problem and the construction of the theory that used it, right? There's this close correspondence between your ability to formulate what this problem is and the theory that you're going to use to solve that problem. So what's experimentation and testing? Well, some of it could be sort of testing the whole thing or a version of the whole thing through minimum viable products. It could be testing. This is sort of the approach that Timo and Jens have taken. It's about testing assumptions. It could be about trying to find solutions and using the theory to search for solutions to problems. Or it could be that through the theory that you simply are able to see surprises. There's a wonderful essay that Herbert Simon wrote very late in his life, reflecting on his own experience as a scientist. And he's reflecting in particular on his very earliest work, which was composing the book Administrative Behavior, and some of the insights that emerged from that. And he's observing the budgeting process in a recreation facility in Milwaukee. That's where his earliest observations occurred. And he says, my training in economics evoked, in the context of they were budgeting, disclosed a contradiction between what theory taught me ought to be happening and what my eyes and ears showed me was actually happening. Without the training in economics, the observed behavior would have appeared entirely natural. Without the observations, I could have continued in the happy illusion that the neoclassical theory of utility maximization explains human behavior in the domain of budgeting. And since my exposure to the economics profession was still rather minimal, I had not acquired the habit so common in the profession of ignoring the real world when it contradicts the theory, right? So he's making a jab at economists here as well. But the key point is that the only reason he recognizes this was a surprise, which he claims was the foundation of his work on identification and bounded rationality, was that he had a theory in his head, right? This is an anomalous thing that I'm observing. And he has other quotes. I mean, this was sort of the origin of his Nobel Prize winning work, was observing a surprise. But the surprise wasn't just that it was random unknown stuff. It was unknown in the context of the theory that he had in his head. So what's theory and belief revision? So, you know, it could be just throwing out a theory that fails, or it could be throwing out, and this is the push that Timo, Eric, and Jens are pushing in their thoughts about belief revision, is throwing out an assumption that fails, right? But keeping the rest, right? You're able to actually accelerate learning because you're not just throwing out a minimum viable product and sort of saying this fails, but you're actually putting out an experiment that says that assumption's wrong. I still believe the rest of my model here. I need to figure out a way to solve that particular subproblem, and then my theory holds, right? It's a very structured approach to experimentation. So if we think about, and this is Timo's example, you think about sort of the problem of how do we make reusable rockets. You say sort of, well, there's a heat problem here. When we take this rocket back through the Earth's atmosphere, how do we keep this thing from burning up? Well, maybe you sort of say, my first solution is going to be we're going to just put heat shields around the entire rocket and let it just drop to the Earth and you know, have a parachute. And then you decide, no, this is too costly after you gather information and data. That doesn't work. You come up with a new assumption, which is, well, let's just land the rocket same way we take it off. We're going to turn it upside down, fire the thrusters, and let it gradually or more gradually pass through the Earth. We don't need heat shields. New assumption. The rest of my model still holds. I've got a pathway to learning. So it's a very structured approach to experimentation that's guided by the theory that one has. This is Simon's comment here. He says, if the outcome of an experiment violates the expectations for it, then make the study of this puzzling phenomenon a task and add it to the agenda. This notion in which, okay, new observation, that assumption didn't hold. Let's take that, make that the problem, keep the rest of the theory, at least the way I would, you know, add to his conclusion here. So what makes a well-structured, what does a well-structured theory provide? It provides a structured belief about the path to solving a problem, a structured path to experimentation and testing, and arguably a basis for this belief revision. In terms of future directions, see, I'm doing what you asked. Future directions. This is a random correlate of what you asked. Build connections. I think there's clearly a connection to the learning literature that has not been adequately developed here. I think there's some interesting questions around Bayesian learning versus belief revision, and some real opportunity to dive in on that topic. I think there's an opportunity to compare and contrast with sort of the neo-Carnegie. Alfonso said this is, you know, Dan's work and Felipe's work. You know, what are the differences between those conceptions of representations and learning and this approach? How can these build on each other or enlighten one another? And obviously, there are lots of further RCTs that need to be done as the theory work evolves and we get better at deciding how to sequence experiments, what types of experiments are useful. Certainly, the hope is that we can be better about the training that we're providing, and if we can be better about the teaching, instruction, and training we're providing, then obviously we have new opportunities to see whether it works and matters, the substance for new and future RCTs. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I think it's been great to see the different perspectives and also different methodologies, qualitative, quantitative, experimental work. We now have about, I think, 20 minutes, so I'd like to open it to any questions from the audience, questions, comments, reactions. So we'll start with Timo here.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to put forward the theory that all four panelists agree, despite the California, non-California distinction. And I think Mary, perhaps, I don't know, that's my hypothesis now, put forward the puzzle piece that integrates the distinction between the discovery and the revolutionary types. So, I mean, you already presented evidence that the discovery types learn in the way that Alfonso and Riitta suggest. So my question or my hypothesis would be, do the revolutionary types learn in the way that Todd was talking about? Belief revision, first principles, Elon Musk, thinking about learning in a mental space and mentally simulating before actually physically trying something out. So that would be a question for, yeah.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you to use the other microphone here?
On?
It's just for recording, so as long as you have it.
Yeah, I just couldn't tell if it was actually on. So this ended up, as with all papers that go through the review process, not making it into the final paper, but the revolutionaries in our sample, at least, and mind you, one industry, small number of firms, didn't think of themselves as not experimenting. And you could argue, experimented on a much more micro level. So for instance, Dayjet, one of the firms in our sample, invested all this money in software, $20 million in a software system to optimize the, planes going all over Florida, right? So huge investment in building this infrastructure. And what they spent a lot of time doing when the big disruption in this industry is that the jets that the industry were supposed to be based on, these very light jets, got delayed by like 2 years. And so these other firms were like, oh, okay, we don't have those jets. We're going to start operating and experimenting and doing things. Dayjet said, oh, well, we're going to just play around with our software model for 2 years, right? So they were experimenting in a way at a different level, but their overall conception of the industry and how it would evolve was sort of static. So I don't know if that's helping to answer your question or not, but
Because they did offline search, right?
right.
Talking about a new type of offline search and thinking about.
Yeah, or we use this term experimentation, but where it's so many levels of analysis, right? So if I think about a company trying to do the things you're talking about, Alfonso, I mean, those are very focused experiments, right? With, where you can actually control and figure out alternative theories, which, can be hard maybe sometimes to actually do. Anyway, I'll stop.
Thank you. I believe we had Joe first. Please.
Thank you. Gil Melech. It's more proposition. I want to hear your reaction about the proposition. In a way, each of you said, present two profiles, or this search is better than this search, or a profile of discovery and revolutionary. And I think the question is, when do we use each type? It's not, each one is a different type. I think, for example, you said that MBAs are not as good at experimentation. Sometimes you need the planning, and sometimes you need experimentation. I think this is part of the question, and because it's when I teach Lean Startup, I say Lean Startup helps you find a local maximum, and Vision helps you to find the global maximum. So I think it's a combination of the two of them. Also, the search of Alfonso. Sometimes you need to have alternative theories. Sometimes maybe it's not the right thing. So I think it's not like two different profiles, but when do you use different mechanisms or tools to do the best choice?
Do you want all of us to answer? Or
Whoever wants to answer, yes, please.
I can
Would you
start.
like to start,
I'll
Katila?
start. So this is very interesting. So Some people say because Lean Startup, if you look at the origin, started, for example, Lean Startup started with software. So shouldn't it always only apply to just software companies? And turns out that what we find is that it actually depends on the team. So it's not so much a industry specific, but it's more of a who the experimenters are, where the people are, and what method they're comfortable. So I would sort of, I think it's a very interesting question. And I haven't, is there a paper out there that looks at it? I don't know. Maybe Mary knows.
That looks like when
When to use different types
to
of
use different.
methods.
Yeah, I mean nothing that I know of offhand. You know, I think.
SEJ, submit your papers on that.
Yeah,
SEJ.
I mean, anecdotally, like when I teach it, I talk about, you know, large scale, you know, nuclear power plants, if we were ever to build those again or something, right? You know, that you probably don't want to use Lean Startup for things like that, right? So, I mean, there's that kind of contingency. But
I mean, you know, clearly one of the contingencies here is how much cost is involved in running the experiment, right? So, you know, if it's a complex problem with multiple assumptions or multiple sub-problems that are involved here, you might be able to gather some data on particular sub-problems. And so, you know, you're doing mental simulation to sort of compose the theory, you're trying to gather information about sub-problems, but if for a complex problem or one where experimentation is very costly, you may never do a minimum viable product because the costs of doing this are exorbitant. So I think there are, you know, there are a bunch of factors that are going to kind of weigh in on how you sequence these things. And it's not just, you know, what type of innovation or entrepreneurship calls for one or the other. It's like when in the process is experimentation called for, and when is mental simulation, and these things, you know, evolve and they're going back and forth.
Let me pick on what Todd said, and I want to make a remark which I think is important. So I think what we are talking about, it's not the kind of experimentation, should I make my product red or blue? We are talking about the big framing decisions of companies. That's why we call them low frequency, high impact decisions. There are, of course, high frequency, low impact decisions in which all sorts of experimentation can go on. Should this website should be blue or red? In these high-level framing decisions, we are not thinking about the classical experiments. Let me set up a randomized control. Maybe, as Todd was saying, many of them come mentally into the head of the entrepreneur or in the board and so on and so forth. It is in this respect that we suggest that what we have not seen and what we hope to show in the future more systematically, it's that the best entrepreneurs are those who always think of an alternative theory, less plausible, less credible, and test that. People who actually think of alternative theories, less plausible, less credible, and don't think, are visionaries. The people we are thinking of, yes, think crazy, but then test it. And if you keep doing it systematically, you learn about the environment and you find the right action. This is the kind of framework that we are thinking of. In this respect, a couple of more remarks to in a very awkward way, try to address some of the questions that Chiara was suggesting. Number one, we are opening up here a big black box of behavioral issues. This is exactly what the people, when the decision scientists said, oh, the states are known, there is no behavior. Now you make the states. So your priors, your confidence, your beliefs, and so on and so forth, they all matter. We know nothing about how these things map into strategy. The third point I want to, domains. What are the domains in which you think about these things? The third point I want to make is, and I hope that Elena, Chiara, Arnaldo will agree with me or not. We are picking on what Todd said. We now have a clear treatment protocol for making randomized controlled trials for this. We'll be very happy to share the things. If someone wants to set up a randomized controlled trials using the theory-based view or the scientific approach, of course, we'll be very happy to modify it but we are open to share if people want to do RCTs in this area so that we cumulate in a more systematic way.
Thank you. I believe there was a question from the gentleman here.
So my question is that, so that session is titled Entrepreneurship, and some of you are clearly talking about entrepreneurs and startup, and some of you are maybe more organizations. And in my view, entrepreneurs are part of kind of organizations. So which of these is applying only to entrepreneurs or any kind of organizations? Because, like, you know, experimentation can happen. Like, university deans can try a new tenure structure or whatever. They don't, but, you know, they could. But, right, so I'm just curious, is it anything more to entrepreneurship than just an applied case of organizations in this case? Or, just curious.
Do we have entrepreneurship scholars in this room? Is that,
Thank you. I think this opens up a big black box. Who would like to try and address that?
Let me just very quickly, since I have the mic, but I will be super quick. We also studied with in our case, we studied with entrepreneurship because an entrepreneur is the obvious person who faces this kind of, especially in the early stages, this kind of decisions. But I think that over time, we realize that this is a more general problem. Absolutely, you're right. This is strategy more than entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is an interesting special case of this problem, but I really think that this is strategy.
I agree.
Well, I was going to say, in a way, that question ties to the question from over here about when does it make sense to do lean startup. So lean startup isn't necessarily the fastest or most efficient way to do things. It's low cost, right? If you're willing and you're a large company that wants to move fast and you're willing to throw more money at things, maybe you don't have such a lean process. You throw more money at it, you move more quickly, and then, you know, the kinds of experiments that we're talking about wouldn't be appropriate. So I think the lean part, you know, what makes entrepreneurial firms different, you know, they tend to be resource constrained. They're, you know, are smaller. That, I mean, right, all the, you know, maybe more agile, you know. So I do think there are differences.
Sure, I'll take. So lean startup is. I feel like I'm again Miss Lean Startup, Alfonso. I don't know how this happened. I'm the Miss Lean Startup. So, okay. So, Lean Startup is actually used more in larger organizations than by entrepreneurs. Just because there are more big corporations out there. So, you know, there is, you know, if you want for your teaching, General Electric, you know, other troubles, but they basically had at one point very successful lean startup, et cetera, et cetera. Governments use lean startup. So I don't know if you want us to answer one way or the other, but I think lean startup tends to be associated with startups and entrepreneurs, but the fact is that it's actually used more by bigger organizations. And in the US, the government, which is pretty remarkable. So they started, National Science Foundation started offering lean startup training to a huge number of teams, so thousands of teams. Then NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, started again with lean startup for its grantees. It's, you know, I think DOE, which is Department of Energy, which then is a bigger projects, right? Started offering lean startups. So I think it's, you know, widely used, and I think this is the paradox for all of us in the room. You know, how come we have such a widely used method, whether it's bigger organizations that all of us strategy scholars are interested in, or smaller ones, or governments or nonprofits, and yet we really don't know if it works or not. So this is the paradox.
So the last panel I was on, they said we want the panelists to disagree and have some energy, and so I will take one exception. I think a lot of large organizations put a label on something that they do, and they call it lean startup, but I'm not sure in reality they are implementing it in a lean way. I think they are experimenting and saying, oh, and we're gonna, you know, try and have hypotheses and play around, but I don't think that they are necessarily implementing it the way that we would think in a purest sense of what is a lean startup methodology of multiple sequential experiments where you take and, you know, all the sort of core principles. I mean, it's a little bit like.
I agree. Yes. Well, most of them don't even have hypotheses.
All right.
Yeah.
So then, is it really lean startup? I mean, you know, who knows? They want to be able to say we're being, you know, agile and we're experimenting. We're doing lean startup. Look at us, right? It's a PR move.
I just want to add one quick comment, which is that arguably the leanest part of what you might call lean startup is the theory development, the mental simulation. Thought experiments are actually far cheaper than real experiments, and that it's really creating that structure around which you then do the experimentation. That's the ultra lean part of an experimental process, not just like, let's just throw a bunch of stuff out there and see what sticks, right? That actually isn't very lean.
So thank you. Also, as someone who teaches corporate entrepreneurship, I'm going to add, I love to see any papers that are looking at this experimentation in large companies, because anecdotally, we're seeing companies doing a lot of really weird things. So as Mary was saying, if you think about these companies that have so many resources, they already know a lot about their customers, why don't they use all of this to run cheap experiments, or at least cost-effective experiments? And I actually have a case study of a large incumbent, Eni, who started a scooter sharing company. They just threw money at the problem. It didn't work. They didn't understand why it didn't work. They closed it down. Then a startup came, used a scientific approach, and figure out what to do. So paradoxically, having resources isn't necessarily a good thing. And it'd be wonderful to explore this more broadly, since we're talking about where else to go. Now, we have a few more minutes, and I've noticed that we have 2 questions on this side. So I'm going to take them both quickly, and then we're going to turn to the panel so we can address them both. We'll start with Amisha over here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Amisha from Boston University. My question is about something I'm observing increasingly, which is that entrepreneurs will experiment. They'll get the results of the experiment. I will interpret the results of the experiment as a failure, and they will interpret the results of the experiment as if they should continue doing exactly what they were doing before. And I'd just like to understand a bit more, why do you think that might be happening? If you think about revolutionaries and discoverers, or are we forcing discoverers to do experimentation when we shouldn't be? Like, what is going on? Do you think that this is not a one-off? This is a pattern of behavior, and I'm just wondering if you can think through why that might be the case.
Thanks a lot. Amisha will go to Jens. A little hard to reach, but I'll do my best. Thank you.
Yes, so I wanted to bring in one topic that has been kind of latent here in the presentations. It's also latent in the literature, and that's the topic of motivation. And because we might think that this process of like entrepreneurial process is like a learning process, a cognitive process, but then I can imagine that at least there's 2 ways in which motivation comes in. So one is what are you actually working towards? So entrepreneurs or strategists are not really in the business of predicting the future more accurately than others, but they're like they want to at least help create a future in which they are somehow better off. So there's some view of the future that is somehow desirable, and the other one, I guess, which has also been present in some of the presentations, is about the process. So obviously there are differences between different individuals in terms of their preferences, how they actually would like to run the process, and then there might be other ways in which motivation comes in and plays together, because typically like motivation and cognition, while you might want to keep them separate, and like economists, for example, they try to keep them separate, but in reality, of course, they're intertwined. So I'm curious to hear your views on that.
Thanks a lot. I see Alfonso would like to start.
I will try to be telegraphic. On Amisha's point, yes, you are opening the black box. That's exactly what we do not know, because now it is clear that behavior matters. So one way to think about it, there are entrepreneurs with systematic methodic doubts, like scientists. They have ideas, but they always think, would it be the good idea? Should I try and experiment with something else? And this is a completely open area for understanding exactly how people want to run experiments. And let me emphasize one point that Todd made: mental experiments, not just real experiments. On Jens' point, yes, motivation is very important. Let me give you one case to be specific about what you said. Danilo Messinese, who is a PhD student from Bocconi, on the market, by the way, he has a wonderful RCT who actually tests the distinction between predictive decision makers, people who actually take the states as given and want to figure out the probability of the states, and people who are non-predictive, who essentially take as given the action and endogenously choose the state in order to fit. And these are 2 different motivations. People who think that the world is exact and you should just have to discover it, and people who think that the world is wrong and want to change it. And I will not tell you the results, just call Danilo and get the paper.
Yeah, so on the motivation question, for me, the unit of analysis at some level here is a problem, right? So you're motivated, the entrepreneur or whoever this actor is motivated by solving a problem, and everything else sort of follows from that. So I'm sure it's a comprehensive response, but that's how I sort of think about the motivation issue. On this fact that we're observing weirdness and irrationality, this is a normative agenda. And I mean, some of the stuff that I think is emerging as to what one should theoretically do, such as, test the weirdest, I'm not sure it's the weirdest, but test the most high variance, problem, or test the weakest premise. These are not obvious kinds of normative suggestions. And, that's the beauty of it, right? If it actually proves to be true and these RCTs confirm these things, we actually have something really substantive to tell people about how you should behave differently as an entrepreneur, rather than just describing the crazy behavior that they engage in, flopping around and somehow finding something. We actually can tell them how to do this thing better. I mean, I think that's really the vision here.
So one of the most popular teaching cases for lean startup is Rent the Runway, where they, rent used expensive clothing. And so one of the things that I always, in teaching this, talk about is they run this minimum viable product experiment, right, where they actually, their uncertainty or question is, are women willing to rent used clothing, basically, right? And they actually have these women, in a room, and I forget the number, say 20% of them rent clothing. So this is to your question, Amisha, right? So is 20% confirming that, yes, lots of people are willing to rent clothing? Or is that a really small number and you say, oh, for only 20% of them were willing to rent clothing, there's no way we could build a market on that? I think part of the problem in the real life sorts of experiments that we run is that there's a level of interpretation about the results. And, depending upon what other assumptions you're making, it's not always obvious whether a hypothesis has been confirmed or not. And then to the question of motivation, I do think motivation is part of what we found was key in this difference between a revolutionary and a discoverer, because the motivation of a revolutionary founder is to change the world. And if they can't change the world, they don't want to bother doing the startup, right? And that causes them to make a series of decisions that might change the way they think about experimenting. Whereas discoverers don't have to change the world, and that enables them to do more incremental things that might make a buck here or there, but the motivation is very different.
Cool. Okay, I realize we're over time, so I'll be very brief. I would just say that think about also the other side. Maybe you don't know whether 20 or 23% is a good number, but you being able to start the conversation in the startup team. So you're articulating things that probably the team has never thought about. So you could flip the question and say, well, do we actually, now that you are interpreting it differently, start a new kind of conversation and the team is able to communicate their ideas? They actually are looking at alternative theories for the first time. So maybe this is a good thing. And then, that there could be benefits. So, and I also wanted to thank organizers. Yes. This was just a fabulous.
Thank you. My last slide. Thank you. Last slide is a thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Tim for helping me co-organize. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.